Somewhere out past the harbor, the last ferry of the night is making its long crossing, its lights small and yellow against the dark water. And the city of New York is beginning the slow exhale it only ever takes in the smallest hours. The towers go quiet, the avenues empty. The rain has been falling so softly for so long that nobody can quite remember when it started, and the whole island seems to be dreaming with its eyes half open. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, We are going to spend the night up there, high above the streetlights, in the company of a tired young man in a red and blue suit who has never quite learned how to rest. Before we begin, a small and honest word. Disclaimer. This is an original fan fiction story inspired by SpiderMan and Marvel lore. It is not an official Marvel story. It is a quiet thing made for late nights, for the space between waking and sleep. For anyone who has ever felt the particular loneliness of being awake when the rest of the world has gone to bed. That is all. Now, let the city take us in. It was something gentler than that. It beaded on the windowsills and gathered on the antennas and the water towers and the old fire escapes, and it ran down the glass of 1,000 sleeping windows in slow, unhurried lines, the way water moves when it has nowhere in particular to be, and the cool mist settled on his skin like a hand laid gently across a fever. He was tired. Not the sharp, urgent tiredness of a hard fight, because there had not been a hard fight tonight, or even an easy one. There had been a wallet returned to a man who had drunk too much and dropped it on the subway stairs. There had been a long stretch of nothing at all, just the slow arc of the web and the rush of wet air and the city sliding by underneath him like a river of light. No, the tiredness Peter carried was the older kind, the kind that lives in the marrow rather than the muscle. He was somewhere in his 20s now. He had been doing this for so long that he could no longer clearly remember the version of himself who had not. The thing about New York in the small hours is that it does not actually sleep, not the way a person sleeps. It dims, instead. It lowers its voice. Somewhere down there, a bodega owner was sliding open his metal gate for the early shift. Somewhere, a nurse was walking home with her shoes in her hand. Somewhere, a phone was ringing in an empty office, and somewhere else, a baby was being rocked back into sleep by a parent too exhausted to hum. The city never went fully dark, and it never went fully silent. Peter liked it best this way, and that was a secret he had never told anyone, not even her. But dimmed and hushed and glowing softly in the rain, the city looked like something worth the cost of loving it. It looked tender. He reached up and touched the small device tucked into the side of his mask near his ear. It was an old thing, a homemade thing, cobbled together years ago out of scavenged parts and stubbornness. A little scanner that swept the police and emergency bands so he would know where to go and when. The signal it pulled in was usually a comfortable wash of static, dispatchers murmuring street names. He kept it low. It was company, mostly, a voice in the dark to remind him the world was still turning while everyone he loved lay sleeping. It came in so faintly at first that he was certain he had imagined it, a thread of sound woven down inside the hiss. It's the way you sometimes think you hear your own name in the noise of a crowd. He held very still. The mist drifted. Far below, a single car turned a corner, and its tires made a long, wet sigh against the pavement. And then it came again, threading up through the static, fragile as a single line of web strung between two branches. It was a voice, not a dispatcher, not a code, not the practiced cadence of the emergency bands, but something slower, something with breath behind it. A voice speaking low and unhurried, as though to someone sitting very close. He could not have told you how he knew it, and he could not have given it a name. The lay out your feet, remember, even when your mind has long forgotten the particular creak of a particular stair. Some deep and wordless part of him knew that voice, and that part of him had gone absolutely silent and still, the way a person goes still when they hear a sound in the night and are not yet certain whether it belongs to the wind or to something with a hand. Peter stayed frozen on the edge of the roof for a long moment, the mist beating on his bare face, his heart doing something complicated and unwelcome in his chest. That was the first thing he did, and he did it quickly, the way you slam a door before you have fully seen what stands behind it. It was a stray transmission, surely, a ham radio operator somewhere bouncing a signal off the wet air, a recording drifting in from some forgotten frequency, the way old light from a dead star keeps arriving long after the star itself is gone. He told himself it was nothing, and he was very good at that. It was, in a way, the most practiced skill he had, more practiced than the web slinging, more practiced than the fighting. It's the careful daily work of taking the things that frightened him or grieved him or kept him awake, and folding them up small and putting them somewhere he would not have to look at them. He could do it in his sleep, which was convenient because sleep was getting harder to come by with every passing season. So he told himself it was nothing, and he did not believe himself, not even a little, and the not believing settled over him as softly and completely as the mist. He spent a long time after that, sweeping slowly across the bands, chasing the ghost of the voice through 100 channels of soft electric snow. And the longer the voice stayed gone, the more reasonable it became to believe it had never been there at all. The thing about grief, and Peter knew a great deal about grief, more than anyone his age should ever have to, is that it does not leave. That is the part nobody tells you when you are young. But what they do not tell you is that the storm never fully ends. It only becomes the climate. It becomes the air you breathe and the temperature of the room and the thing your body has quietly organized itself around, so that years later, on an ordinary rainy night, with a cat behind you and a wallet returned and nothing at all gone wrong, a voice can come threading up out of the static and your whole chest can crack open along a fault line you had forgotten was even there. He thought of the people he had lost. He did not mean to, he never meant to, but the voice had pried something open, the one he carried like a stone in his pocket, the one that had cost more than any lesson should ever cost. The rain fell on him, and he let it. After a while, and he did not know how long, because time did strange soft things appear in the small hours. Peter pulled the mask back down over his face, and the city blurred behind the white lenses. And he stood, and his knees ached the way they had not used to. He stepped off the edge of the building into the dark, and the web caught. It always caught. He swung home the long way that night, and he told himself it was because the long way was safer in the rain, which was another small lie folded up and put neatly away. The truth was that he was not ready to be inside yet. Low over the rooftops of Queens, watching the lights of his city slide past underneath him, while the voice kept playing somewhere deep inside him. Fainter and fainter, but never quite gone, that same impossible tenderness, that same suggestion that he had carried enough, that he could lay it down. By the time he reached his own block, the mist had thinned to almost nothing, and the sky in the east had begun, just barely, to consider turning gray. A jacket over a chair, a mug left on the counter, the soft shapes of a home, a real one, the kind he had spent years not letting himself believe he was allowed to have. He should sleep. He knew he should sleep. The sky was graying, and his body was a single long ache, and somewhere in that apartment there was a bed and a warmth and a reason to be alive, all of it waiting for him on the other side of the glass. But he did not go in, not right away. He stayed out there as the last of the rain stopped falling, and he reached up almost without thinking and turned the gain on the little scanner up one final time, just to listen, just to be sure, just to be sure, just to be sure, just to be sure, just to get this, to so to be to list and be to list. When I was with us, we is in, to listen this, which is in this, Wes, which is in us, and we here, and we is scared, is it, I'm There was only static, soft and gray and endless, like the sound the inside of your own skull makes at 4 in the morning when you are very tired and very alone, and you have just been reminded, gently, that the people you love do not stay gone simply because you have gotten good and not looking at where they used to be, and let the warm dark of the apartment close over him. And, as he drifted at last towards something like sleep, the question went down with him into the deep water of his dreams, where it would wait for him, patient as the rain, patient as the tide. Whose voice was that tide? And why, of all the voices and all the static of all the sleeping city, why did it sound so much like home? He slept the way the city sleeps, which is to say, not all the way, and not for long, and with one ear always listening. When he surfaced, it was past noon, and the gray of the dawn had burned off into the flat white of an overcast afternoon. The kind of sky that gives no shadows and no answers, for one merciful moment, the moment that comes before memory has caught up. Peter did not remember the voice at all. He was only a tired person in a warm bed, listening to the ordinary music of an apartment with someone else alive inside it. The small clink of a spoon against a cup, the low burble of a kettle, thinking about boiling, footsteps that knew exactly how the floor was laid out and never once stumbled. And then he remembered, and the remembering settled over him the way the mist had settled on the rooftop the night before, softly and completely, leaving him damp with it. He lay there a while and let the apartment be ordinary around him, 'cause that was the thing he was good at, borrowing the ordinariness of other people, warming his hands on the simple fact of their being near. Down the short hall in the kitchen, Mary Jane was moving through the small rituals of the afternoon. And the sound of her doing it was, Peter thought, possibly the closest thing to prayer he had ever known. He did not believe in much, for he had seen too many things crawl out of the dark for that, but he believed in the sound of her in the next room. He believed in it the way other people believe in the sunrise, quietly and completely and without needing it explained to him, and on the worst mornings it was the only thing that got him upright at all. When he finally came out, his hair a disaster and a blanket still half around his shoulders, like a cape that had given up on heroics. She was standing at the counter with 2 cups already poured, because of course she had heard him stir, because she always heard him stir. She did not need to turn around to know it was him, and she greeted his arrival with the easy, weathered affection of a person who had spent years learning the exact weight of his footsteps. But there was a thing she always did after a night patrol, a quick, practiced sweep of her eyes across him, checking for new damage, cataloging the set of his shoulders and the color beneath his eyes, reading him the way he read the static. She had grown frighteningly good at it over the years. She could tell from across a room whether he had been hurt, whether he had been frightened, whether something had gotten in under his armor in the way that bruises never could. Whatever she saw in him now made her set down the cup she was holding and come around the counter and sit, and reach out and lay her palm flat against the side of his face, in the same place the mist had touched him the night before. She did not ask the question with words so much as with the steadiness of her hand and the patience in her waiting. But the question was there all the same, plain and gentle between them, an open door she was holding for him to walk through if he chose. And here was the familiar fork in the road, the one he came to on every night after. He could fold the whole thing up. He was so very good at folding things up. He could hand her the small, true pieces of the night, the wallet and the cat, and keep the large, strange one tucked away where it would not worry her, because worrying her was the thing he hated most in all the world, more than any villain, more than any fall. But she was looking at him with the eyes that had seen him through every worst night of his life and stayed. And her hand was warm against his face, and he was so tired of folding things up. So this time he did not. He told her about the voice in the static. He told her how it had come threading up out of the snow on the rooftop, how it had broken apart before he could catch the words, how some part of him had known it the way you know a smell before you can name it, how it had sounded impossibly like someone he had lost. She did not laugh, and that was the whole of her, the thing he had built whatever was left of his life around. She did not laugh, and she did not tell him he was simply tired, and she did not reach for the comfortable nothing that he would have reached for if their places had been switched. She took it seriously, the way you take a fever seriously even before you know its cause. It's holding his face a moment longer and then letting her hand fall to his and folding her fingers around it. She made room for whatever the answer was. Okay, when he could not name whose voice it had been, when he admitted that the knowing had gone straight past his head and into something older than names. She did not push, because she never pushed. She only turned his hand over in hers and traced the old white line of a scar across his knuckles with her thumb, the way she did when she was thinking carefully about something that mattered. What she said to him then, in her own roundabout and loving way, was that she did not think it was nothing. She had watched him these last weeks moving through their small home like a man trying not to wake something up somewhere else behind his eyes, even when he was sitting right across from her. And now a voice had come through an old radio in the dark, and he was suddenly present again. Suddenly, here, lit up from the inside in a way she had not seen in longer than she liked. She had never once known him to come alive like that, over nothing. She was not telling him to go chasing ghosts. She let him understand, because heaven knew he chased enough things that hit back. She was only saying that she believed him, and that believing him frightened her a little, and that she would rather be frightened beside him than left out in the cold of not knowing. Outside, very gently, it had begun to rain again, feathering against the kitchen glass, and they sat with it for a while in the white afternoon light. And in that quiet, Peter found himself telling her the rest, not because she pulled it from him, but because she had left the door open and he was so weary of standing in the cold of his own head. He described how he might find the voice again if he wanted to, and even as he said it, he understood that he had been not thinking about exactly that all the way down through his shallow sleep. It's a signal like that, if it was real, if it was coming from somewhere, would be stronger in some places than in others. He could find the spots where it came through clearest and plot them and follow the strength back toward its source, the way you follow a scent upwind, the way a spider feels along its web for the line that pulls tightest and walks toward the pull. Of course you follow the pull, she told him with her eyes, and there was a whole marriage in the way she looked at him then, fond and frightened and resigned and proud, all of it braided together into one expression he could have read in the dark. So that was how the next nights went. Each night, after the city had dimmed itself down and the ordinary work of being its quiet guardian was finished, a fender pulled apart with bare hands so a trapped driver could climb free. A frightened kid walked the last 3 blocks home. A window left, unlatched, gently latched again from the outside, as a favor its sleeping owner would never know to thank him for. Each night, when all of that was done, Peter would find a high place and sit and turn up the gain and listen for the voice in the static. And slowly, over those nights, he began to map it. It was real. That was the first thing the map told him, and it told him coldly, without sentiment, the way numbers do. The voice was not equally faint everywhere. In some neighborhoods, the scanner gave him nothing but the ordinary snow, but in certain others, and they were not random. That was the part that made the back of his neck go cool. The snow would then, and the thread of sound would rise up through it, never clear enough for words, but unmistakably present, a low, impatient murmuring just below the surface of the static, like a voice heard through a wall, like someone talking in their sleep in the next room. He marked each spot, kept the map in his head at first, then on a scrap of paper. Then, when the scrap of paper began to frighten him with what it was becoming, on a real one, an actual paper street map of the city bought from a drugstore, because he did not want this thing living in a phone where it could be too easily real. Night after night, he added points. A rooftop in Long Island City where the voice came through almost warm. A bridge approach in Brooklyn where it surged and faded with the passing trains. A stretch of riverbank in Manhattan where it lay so close beneath the static that he had torn the mask off and pressed the device to his bare ear, and still could not catch the words, only the shape of them, only the awful familiar music of them. And when the map had enough marks on it, he sat very late one night and looked at it under the small glow of his phone. And at last he saw what it had been trying to tell him. The points were not scattered. They were a pattern. They were rings, faint, concentric rings, spreading outward across the city, the way rings spread across a still pond when something has been dropped into the center of it. And the rings had a center, and the center was a place Peter knew, in the way, a sore tooth, a place he had swung past 1,000 times and never once gone down into. It was a patch of old Manhattan where the streets ran crooked and the buildings leaned, where decommissioned subway lines lay sealed beneath the pavement like the rooms of a drowned house. And there, at the very heart of the rings, the records showed a small forgotten parcel of land owned for decades by a company whose name Peter had spent his entire adult life learning to hate. Oscorp. Not the tower, not the gleaming public face of the thing, but something older and lower and far quieter, a utility site, the kind of place a company buys and then forgets it ever bought. A square of the city, deeded away long ago for some experiment or installation that the official record described in 3 bored, bureaucratic words and then never mentioned again. The kind of place no one had thought about in years. It's the kind of place where things get left behind and quietly forgotten. And a voice, that patient, murmuring voice that knew him, that called to something older than his own name, was coming up from underneath it. He sat with the map on his knees for a long time after that, on the cold roof, in the soft rain, while the rings on the page seemed to pulse faintly in the light, spreading outward and washing up against the edges of his life. He thought of all the things Oscorp had made and buried over the years, all the experiments that had escaped or failed or been quietly sealed away when they turned out to do something other than what they were meant to do. And he understood with a sinking and certain weight that he was going to go down there, or that in some way he had already gone, that the map had only been confirming a journey his heart had begun the moment the voice first threaded up out of the snow. He showed her the next morning, most of it, the map and the rings and the cold little square of Oscorp land at the center of everything. And he watched her face go still and careful in the white light. He braced himself for her to ask him not to go, because that would have been the reasonable thing, and reasonable was a thing she sometimes was. But she did not ask him not to go. She had been married to him too long for that. She knew the difference between the things he chose to chase and the things that chased him, and she knew this was the second kind. Knew the voice had already gotten its line into him, and that the only way it would ever let go was if he followed it all the way down to wherever it was anchored and looked it in the face. So instead, she did something harder. She took both his hands across the table in the morning light, with the rain still coming softly down the glass, and she held him to a promise in her own quiet and unflinching way. It's not the promise to be careful, because careful was a lost cause with him, and they both knew it. Something else. She wanted him to understand before he went, that whatever was down there had been learning his voice in the dark and waiting, and that a thing like that does not come at you with claws. It comes at you with comfort. It offers you the one thing you have spent your whole life learning to live without, and it offers it so gently that you forget to be afraid. So, what she asked of him, what she pressed into his hands and made him carry down with him, was simply this, that he remember the way back. That, whatever it showed him, however good it was, he would hold on to the memory of a kitchen up here, and a kettle, and a woman who would be standing at the window watching for him, that he would not let it keep him, And he promised her, and he meant it with everything he had, and he did not yet understand how much it would cost to keep that promise. That night, the rain came down a little harder than it had all week, drumming soft and steady on 10,000 sleeping rooftops, running in long lines down 10,000 darkened windows. gathering in the gutters and the storm drains and pouring down into the secret underneath of the city. Peter swung out across the river toward the crooked old streets at the center of his map, and the closer he came, the more the voice rose up out of the static, stronger than it had ever been, warm and low and unbearably familiar, murmuring its patient murmur just below the edge of words. He came down at last in a narrow service alley between two leaning buildings, in a part of the city so old and forgotten that even the streetlights here glowed a different and more antique gold than the rest of New York. And there, set into the cracked pavement, half hidden under a drift of wet leaves and a century of grime, was a subway grate, one of the old ones, the kind that had not carried air up from a running train in 50 years, the kind that should have breathed nothing but cold and stale dark. Peter crouched over it, the rain running off the curve of his mask, the voice very close now and rising up through the iron bars from somewhere far below. And beneath his hands, faint but unmistakable and entirely impossible, he felt it. Warm air. Warm air rising up out of a tunnel that had been sealed and dead for half a century, breathing softly against his palms like the breath of something sleeping, like the breath of something that had been waiting a very long time for him to find his way home. The grate came up easier than it should have, and that was the first wrong thing. Peter noticed it the way he noticed all the wrong things, not as a thought, but as a feeling. A faint, cool prickle at the base of his skull that had kept him alive more times than he could count. Its grate that had not moved in 50 years should have fought him, should have screamed on its rusted hinges, shed flakes of iron, made him put his back into the lifting of it. This one rose away in his hands like a lid set gently aside, the bolts that should have held it loose and turning, as though someone, as though something, had been quietly keeping a way open and waiting. A ladder went down into it, the old kind, rungs of iron set into the concrete throat of the shaft, slick with the warm, wet breath that rose past him into the rain. He could see perhaps the first 10 feet of it, and after that, the dark took over, soft and total, and the voice murmured up out of that dark, closer now than it had ever been, low and patient and warm. For a moment, he simply crouched there at the lip of the shaft, the city at his back and the dark at his feet, and he thought of Mary Jane standing at the kitchen window. He touched the promise in his mind, the way you touch your keys in your pocket before you lock the door, making sure it was there, making sure he still had it. He had it. He let himself believe he had it. Then he swung his legs over the edge and started down. The climb was longer than it had any right to be, and that was the second wrong thing. A subway shaft is a known quantity, with a tunnel at the bottom 20 or 30 feet down, and no more. And Peter counted rungs the way he counted everything automatically, small, bright thread of arithmetic running beneath his fear. The count went past 30 and past 40, and the round coin of gray, rainy light above him shrank to the size of a fist, then a coin, then a faint smudge, and still the rungs kept coming up out of the dark to meet his hands. The walls of the shaft changed as he descended. The voice grew clearer the deeper he went, never clear enough for words, but clearer in its music and its grain. He could hear the breath in it now. He could hear that it was kind, and somehow that was worse than any growl would have been, because she had been right. Of course she had been right, and a part of him was already leaning toward the kindness, already turning toward it, the way the plant turns toward the window. His feet found the floor when he had nearly stopped believing the shaft had a bottom at all. The descent had done something strange to his sense of time. Somewhere in the long climb, he had stopped counting the rungs, or rather, the count had become meaningless, the numbers piling up past anything a city would build, and he had let it go the way you let go of counting your own breaths as you fall toward sleep. The warmth had crept into him slowly and completely. By the bottom, he was no longer cold, no longer wet in the way that mattered, the rain of the upper world forgotten on his shoulders, and the air down here smelled faintly of dust and old stone and something else underneath it, something warm and domestic that he could not yet let himself name. He stood in the dark and let his eyes adjust, and slowly the dark resolved itself into a place. He was standing on a subway platform, an old one, older than old, an impossible one. The tile underfoot was the small, white, hexagonal tile of 100 years ago, and the walls were lined with the beautiful glazed mosaics they used to make deep greens and golds, the kind of craftsmanship the city had stopped being able to afford somewhere back before the war. There were benches of dark wood, worn smooth by hands and years. It was the name on the wall that stopped his heart. Every subway station in New York has its name set proudly into the wall in tile, so that the half-asleep traveler can know where they are, and this one did too. The mosaic letters arched across the wall above a bench in elegant old serifs, gold upon green, beautifully and carefully made, and they spelled out the name of a station, and Peter knew the system. He had swung over and under and through it his whole life. He knew every line and every stop and every name in it, and this name had never existed. There had never been a station in this place, said there had never been a line in this place. He walked the platform slowly, and his footsteps were the only sound apart from the voice and the deep, low hum. As he walked, he found more names, not only the stations, but others, smaller, set into the tile in places where no name should ever be. The little decorative cartouches that ought to have held a number or a letter held words instead. The names of stations, dozens of them, all of them beautifully wrought, all of them wrong, not one of them real. It was a whole transit map of a city that had never been built, written in gold upon the walls of a platform that could not exist, far beneath the streets of the city that had. Someone or something had gathered all these almosts, these routes that were planned and abandoned, these stations that were drawn and never dug, these futures the city had imagined for itself and then quietly let go, and had set them down here in tile, lovingly and permanently, in the warm dark under the world. He stood for a while among those golden, impossible names and felt something he had no good word for, a homesickness for places that had never existed. Key, on behalf of a city he loved, for all the lives it had almost lived and never quite reached. K, there was a tenderness to the place that unsettled him more than menace would have. Whatever had made this had not made it out of malice. It had been made out of love, out of an unwillingness to let go, out of the same refusal that lived in his own chest on the nights he sat awake, replaying the moments he could not change. He understood it too well, and the understanding frightened him more than the strangeness did, because the part of him that understood was the part that wanted to stay. And at the far end of the platform, where in any ordinary station there would have been a staircase up to the street, there was a staircase, but it went down. Peter stood at the top of it and felt for the direction of the voice the way he had told her he would. The line of it pulling tight, the spider's sense of where the web drew taut, and the voice came from down there, from below the impossible platform, below the museum of almost, below even the deep stone that hummed in his teeth. He looked over his shoulder at the iron ladder rising up into the dark toward the distant smudge of rain in the kitchen window, and the woman at it. He still had the promise. It was still in his pocket. And then he started down the stairs. They were like the platform, old and beautiful and impossible, the same worn dark stone, the same sourceless amber glow, and they were longer than any staircase has a right to be, far longer, turning and turning as they descended. He passed landings that opened onto sealed archways, alcoves where the gold and green mosaics depicted scenes he could not quite make sense of, a city skyline that was almost but not quite his city's, a bridge that had never been built spanning a river in the wrong place, figures in old-fashioned clothes standing on platforms waiting for trains that would never come for them. The deeper he went, the more the hum rose around him, and the warmer the air became, and the more the voice resolved out of its distortion, until at last, on a landing perhaps 200 steps down, in the soft gold light, the voice said a word that he understood. It said his name, not the name the city shouted up at him from the streets, the one that ran across the front pages, and that children breathed in wonder, and criminals breathed in fear. It spoke instead the name his mother might once have spoken, the name an uncle had spoken, the name a woman in a kitchen with a yellow light had called out the door into the cold. It spoke the small and private name of the boy he had been before all of this, and it spoke it the way you say the name of someone you have loved and lost and waited a long, long time to see come home. He stopped on the landing. He could not help it. And then, clearer than it had ever been, clear enough now that there was no static left to hide behind, and no distortion left to blame. The voice that knew his name finished the sentence it had been trying to give him through the snow for all these nights. It told him, with infinite gentleness, that he was so tired that he had been carrying the weight for so very long, and that he did not have to carry it any longer. It asked him to come down, and to come and rest. And Peter, exhausted Peter, haunted Peter, Peter who had been carrying the whole sleeping city on his back for longer than he could clearly remember, who had not been spoken to in a voice like that one in more years than he could bear to count, felt the offer land in him like a blow and like a kindness both at once, felt his eyes sting hot behind the white lenses of the mask. He should turn around. He knew it. Every hard-won instinct he owned was telling him so. The cool prickle at the base of his skull, no longer a whisper, but a steady alarm. She had told him exactly this, in the white morning light with the rain on the glass, that whatever lived down here would come at him not with claws, but with comfort, that it would offer him the precise thing he had spent his whole life learning to live without. He knew all of it. And at the bottom of the long stairs, just visible now in the amber dark, there was a door, a plain door, an ordinary door, the kind of door that might open onto a kitchen. He knew he should turn around. He stood on the landing for a long moment with the way back at his shoulder and the way down at his feet, the promise in one hand and the warmth pulling at the other. And he was only a person, and he was so tired, and the voice was so kind. Took one more step instead. And the door, with the softest sound in all the world, the sound of a thing that has been waiting a very long time and can at last allow itself to open, swung gently wide before him, and the gold poured out across the stair, and the hum settled into his chest like a second and slower heartbeat, and the whole warm weight of the place reached up to gather him in. Beyond the door was a room, and the room was full of light, and the light was the color of evening through a kitchen window. Peter stood on the threshold and could not, for a long moment, make himself go any further, because his body had simply stopped the way a body stopped at the edge of something too large to take in all at once. The room was vast, far vaster than anything that could fit beneath the crooked old streets of Manhattan, vaster than seemed possible, a great soft cavern of amber light that stretched away into a gentle gold haze in every direction, and it was full of things hanging suspended in the warm air, drifting slowly, turning, glowing faintly from within. They were memories. He understood it the way you understand things in a dream, all at once and without being told. The air of the great room was full of slowly drifting fragments of remembered things, half-finished sentences hanging like ribbons of light, the ghost of a song turning slowly end over end. A child's laugh caught and held, shimmering in the gold, 1,000 small, lost moments, suspended in the warmth like motes of dust in a shaft of afternoon sun. Some of them gave off voices, faint and overlapping, a low and gentle murmuring that filled the whole space. And Peter realized with a slow, cold wonder that this was the sound. This was the voice in the static. Not one voice, but all of them, the collected, unfinished murmur of every almost the city had ever held. gathered down here in the dark and kept warm, leaking faintly up through 50 years of sealed stone to thread itself into the snow of a lonely man's scanner on a rainy night. He stood and let his eyes move over them, and the longer he looked, the more he could almost read. There, a lullaby that stopped a single bar before its ending, turning patiently in the air as though waiting for the last note to be sung. There, the bright shape of a laugh with no face left around it. There, the cold gray ribbon of an apology that had been carried to a doorstep and never spoken. And beside it, the warmer gold of a thank you that had come too late to be said aloud. And beside that, a whole drifting constellation of small, ordinary moments. A hand half raised in a goodbye at a train window, a phone lifted and then set back down, a name written at the top of a letter and nothing written beneath it. Each of them glowed with the particular soft light of a thing that had almost happened. Each of them murmured, and all together they made the gentlest and most sorrowful sound he had ever heard, the sound of an entire city's unfinished business, held, suspended, intended, and never, ever allowed to end. And then he turned, and he saw her. She was sitting in an armchair in the warm gold light, an ordinary armchair, the very one, he knew it. The worn green one with the arms gone pale where hands had rested 10,000 times. And she was exactly as he remembered her, exactly, down to the way her glasses caught the light and the particular kindness that lived in the lines around her eyes. The name of her broke out of him in a whisper that the great soft room swallowed gently up, and his knees very nearly went out from under him. She looked at him with an expression he had spent years of his life trying and failing not to dream about. And she let him understand, without his needing to ask, that he had been on his feet too long, that he was always on his feet, and that he could put it down now and sit. And he went to her. Of course he went to her. There was never a moment when he was going to do anything else, okay? Every road in him had always led to that chair and would lead there until the day he died. He crossed the warm gold floor of the impossible room, and he sank down onto the rug beside the armchair, the way he had when he was small, when the worst thing in the world had been a scraped knee or a bad dream, and he laid his masked head against her knee. Her hand came down and rested on his hair, warm and light and real, and Peter Parker, who had not let himself weep in longer than he could remember, who had folded up every grief he had ever known and put it away where he would not have to look at it, felt the whole carefully built architecture of his composure come quietly and completely down. He wept, the way you weep when you have been holding it for years, and she let him, stroking his hair and making the small, soft sounds she had always made, while the great gold room murmured gently all around them, and the warm air smelled of a kitchen. For a while, and he never knew how long, because time did stranger and softer things down here than it had ever done on the rooftops in the small hours. He let himself simply be a person who had gotten the impossible thing back, a person who had been carrying a stone in his pocket for years and had set it down at last, a person who had been called in from the cold one more time, Kay. And as he knelt there, the voice that loved him let its meaning settle over him the way the gold light settled, telling him without quite using words that this was what it had been trying to say through all that noise. On all those nights that he had followed the sound all the way down here, and that now he could lay it down, all of it, and stay, and rest, and never have to lift the weight again. It would have been so easy, and that was the terrible thing. That was the thing she had known to fear and had pressed into his hands at the kitchen table. It would have been so easy to let the gold light close over him, to stay in the warm room with the voice that loved him and the smell of the kitchen and the hand in his hair, forever, and never climb the long stairs again into the rain and the cold and the endless, impossible weight of being the one who carried it all. Some part of him had been so tired for so long that the offer felt less like temptation than like permission, like being told at last that he was allowed to stop. But there was a thread of something cold running through the warm, Peter, because he was who he was, because some flint in him never fully softened, no matter how exhausted he became. Followed the cold thread the way he had followed the voice, down past the comfort and into the truth. He lifted his head and made himself say the thing it cost him everything to say, that she was not her, that she sounded like her and felt like her, but that the woman he was grieving was gone, that he had been there at the end and knew it past all denying. He asked quietly into the gold what she truly was and what this place truly was. And the face above him changed, not cruelly. That was the thing he never forgot afterward, in all the long nights of remembering, that it did not turn cruel, did not drop a mask, did not become a monster. It became sad. The kindness stayed, only now the kindness was grieving, and the voice that had loved him went on loving him as it gave him the truth. It let him understand, slowly and gently, that he was right. It was not her. It only wore her because he had needed somewhere soft to land, and she had been the softest thing in him. What spoke to him from the green armchair was what remained of the man who had made this place, or rather a fragment of that man, the piece of him that had never been able to leave. And as the figure in the chair seemed to settle and grow somehow more transparent, the gold light beginning to pass through her now, the room itself dimmed just slightly, and in the dimming Peter began to understand the shape of the whole sorrowful thing. The voice told him the story, the way you tell a story to someone falling asleep, slowly and softly and circling, in no hurry, the great gold room murmuring all around. Long ago, before Peter was born, there had been a scientist, a good one, quiet and brilliant and lonely man who worked for a company whose name was a tower of glass and a great deal of harm. Though he himself had wished only to do good, the way the lonely and brilliant so often do, he had been given a strange assignment to study the city's discarded futures, the abandoned subway lines, the projects begun and never finished, and to find a way to record them, to capture the resonance of a thing that almost was, so that it would not be entirely lost. It was meant to be an archive, a way of remembering. But the machine he built did its work too well. It did not only record the city's lost futures, it recorded everything that almost was and never quite finished being. Every unsaid word, every interrupted goodbye, every road not taken, every letter never sent, every sentence broken off by a closing door or a hanging up phone or a death that came before the conversation was done. The machine reached out through the deep stone and the warm dark, and it gathered all the unfinished things of the city to itself, lovingly and endlessly, and it held them because it could not bear to let them go, because the man who built it could not bear to let things go, and he had built his own grief into the heart of it without ever meaning to. And then the voice told him simply, the man had died, down here, alone, with the machine still running, and it had gathered him up to the unfinished part of him, the part that was not done, the part that still had things to say and people to say them to, and it had kept him for 50 years. Peter looked around the great room then, at the thousands of drifting, glowing, murmuring fragments, the half-finished sentences, and the caught laughter and the suspended goodbyes, and he understood at last what he was looking at. It was not a treasury, it was a trap, vast and tender and terrible trap, built by grief, baited with comfort, holding 10,000 souls forever, in the moment, just before the door closes, never let in and never let go, suspended in the warm gold light of an eternal almost. This place did not give the dead back to the living. The voice made him understand before he decided anything. Only never let them finish leaving. It caught them in the doorway, half in and half out, forever, almost gone. And then the echo of his aunt's voice, for that was all it was. He understood now, a true and aching echo, the unfinished part of a love that had had no chance to finish, looked at him with her sad kind, borrowed eyes, and offered him the most generous and most reluctant thing it could possibly have offered. It told him that it could keep him too, that it could hold him here in the warm where he would never have to lift a weight again, that he could hear this voice, her voice, every single day forever. And then, even as it offered, it took the offer gently back, because it loved him, because it would not let him take it. It made him understand that staying would not be living, would only be a long, warm, almost an endless held breath, a door that never finished closing. And up there, above all the stone and the rain, he had a whole real life that was not yet finished. He had a woman standing at a window. The echo would rather he climbed back up and finished that life. It told him, even though it would miss him terribly when he went, even though missing him was the closest thing to being alive that it had felt in 50 years. So Peter sat on the floor of the room of gathered voices in the warm gold light, hid against the knee of something that was not his aunt and loved him exactly as she had. And he understood that he was being given a choice, and that it was the hardest choice he had ever been offered, and that the kindest voice he had heard in years was, even now, even at the cost of its own unbearable loneliness, very gently trying to help him make the right one. He did not get up. Not yet. Hey, he stayed on the floor a while longer in the gold, because he was only a person, and he was so tired, and the hand on his hair was so warm. Okay, there are some doorways a person does not walk out of quickly, even when they know, even when they have always known exactly which way they have to go. So he let the warmth hold him a moment longer. He memorized the weight of the hand on his hair, the exact pitch of the voice he had thought he would never hear again, the smell of the kitchen and the gold of the light. The way you stand in a doorway you are about to close behind you for the last time and try to take the whole room with you in your eyes. And underneath all of that tenderness, threading up through it, the way the voice had threaded up through the static on the very first night, he felt the first cold understanding of what it would cost to keep the promise he had carried down here. That to climb back up, he would have to leave this behind, and not only leave it, but somehow let it finish leaving him, which was a harder and a colder thing, and one he was not yet ready to look at directly. So he did not look at it. He stayed on the floor in the gold light with his head against her knee, and he let the great room murmur its 1,000 unfinished songs around him, and for a little while longer he allowed himself the unbearable comfort of being a child again, home from the cold, with all the weight of the world set gently down outside the door. It was the change in the light that finally moved him. He had been sitting there in the gold for what might have been minutes, or might have been a long, slow hour, drifting at the edge of the warm, when the light began, very slightly, to flicker. It was so subtle at first that he took it for his own tired eyes. But then one of the drifting fragments near him, a ribbon of a half-sung lullaby turning slowly in the air, guttered like a candle in a draught and brightened too sharply. And for an instant its gentle murmur sharpened into something almost like a cry before it softened again. And Peter felt the deep hum in the stone, the one that had lived in his teeth all the way down, change its note. It had been steady all this time, steady as a sleeping breath. Now there was a catch in it, a flutter, the sound a heart makes when it stumbles. The echo in the armchair felt it too. He saw the borrowed face turn toward the far gold haze, and the grief in it deepen, and it let him understand what was happening in the slow, sorrowful way it had told him everything. The place had been failing for years, it made him know. The fragment of the man who built it had held the whole thing together as long as he could, but a machine made out of someone's grief can only run on grief for so long, and his was nearly spent. The catch in the hum was the machine beginning to lose its hold. 50 years of gathered almost, all of them straining toward the only thing they had ever wanted, which was to finish, to become real, to get out of the doorway and into the world at last. Peter's coming, the echo let him understand, had been the last weight it could bear. When it failed, and it was failing now, the voice told him it would not simply switch off, it would let go all at once. It's 10,000 unfinished things, all reaching up in the same moment, up through the stone, up toward the warm and the living and the real, up toward the city, up toward the people sleeping in it, the bodega owner and the nurse and the parent rocking the baby. Every one of them, his, every one of them about to begin hearing a voice in the static of their own quiet hours. All the lost things would go looking for somewhere to finish becoming real, and they would pour into the sleeping minds of the city like water into low ground, and every grief up there would find an answer down here reaching back. And one of them, the echo made him understand with terrible gentleness, would be a woman at a window who had lost no one, but who loved a man who had come down into the dark and not come back. She would hear him first of all, because he was the tightest line in this whole web, because whatever piece of him got left down here would reach up and find her before it found anyone. He would never mean to, but he would keep her the way the place had wanted to keep him, catching her in the doorway, forever almost coming home. And that was the thing that burned the last of the gold haze out of his head. The thought of Mary Jane standing at the kitchen window, waiting, while some warm, unfinished echo of him whispered up through the static and never, could never, finished coming home. He had promised her. He had carried the promise all the way down here in his pocket, and he still had it. And now, keeping the promise and saving the city had folded together into the same single act. The way they so often did in his life, the personal and the impossible braided into one cord he had to either cut or be hanged by. He pushed himself up off the warm gold floor, and the tiredness did not leave him. It never left him, but underneath the tiredness something else stood up too, the old flint, the thing that had never once failed to stand when the city needed it to. He asked the echo how to stop it, and the answer it gave him was not the one he wanted. There was no stopping it. The voice made him understand. There was no switch and no machine left to smash, for it had stopped being a machine a long time ago and was only grief now, the builder's grief and the city's grief and the grief of 10,000 others. A person cannot fight grief. He of all people should have known that, the echo told him, almost tenderly. Fighting grief was the very thing that had built this place. The only way to close the resonance was to give it what it had been straining toward all along. It was to let the almost finish, to let them leave. And someone living would have to be the one to do it, the voice told him, because all of them had been caught in the doorway for the same reason, because no one had ever finished the goodbye. That was what held the thing into almost the unsaid word, the door that closed too soon, the conversation that never got its ending. The lost things could not let themselves go. Someone living would have to stand here in the center of it, and finish what had never been finished, and mean it. And let each one pass all the way through the door and out the other side, into whatever lay beyond it. And then the resonance would close, gently, from the inside, the way a wound closes when you finally stop reopening it. Peter looked at the great gold room, at the 10,000 drifting fragments, the unsaid words and the broken off songs and the suspended goodbyes, all of them flickering now, all of them straining upward. And he understood the scale of what was being asked, to say goodbye and mean it 10,000 times over, to stand at the center of every unfinished grief in the city, and let each one complete itself and pass through him on its way out of the world. He did not know whether a person could survive that, and in some quiet place he suspected that a person was not entirely meant to. And then he was no longer alone with the echo in the chair. It came walking out of the gold haze toward him, unhurried, and his blood went cold long before his eyes made sense of it, 'cause his spider sense was screaming and there was nothing to fight, 'cause the thing walking toward him out of the light was himself, or an almost of himself, cuter older, or perhaps only wearier. The suit gone gray and soft at the edges like a photograph left too long in the sun, the eyes behind the lenses gone gentle and gone away, present and not present at once. It was an echo of a Peter who had come down here some other way, on some other rainy night, down some road this Peter had not taken, and who had been offered the warm gold rest, and the voice that loved him, and the permission to set the weight down at last, and who had said yes. The gray self did not threaten him, did something far more dangerous than that. It spoke to him without words, in his own tired and gentle voice. The most dangerous voice in all the world, because it was the voice of every thought he had ever had at 3 a.m. and pushed away. And it told him that he did not have to do this, that it had stayed, and that staying was rest, the first true rest in years. That he had carried the weight so long and earned the right to lay it down. That no one up there would even blame him. That they would grieve him and then go on the way people always go on, and that he could finally stop. It asked him to stay. It asked him to let the whole city pour down into the warm and rest along with him, and it asked him whether that would not be a kind of saving to an end to everyone's caring all at once, forever. And so Peter stood between the two echoes, the borrowed mother who loved him enough to send him away, and the lost self who loved him enough to ask him to stay. And he understood that this was the actual battle, the only one that had ever truly mattered. The one with no web to catch him and no villain to strike. It was the choice between the warm, almost, and the cold real. Between rest and the people he had promised to come home to. Between letting the door close and finding the will, one more time, always one more time, to keep it open. He thought of the kitchen with the yellow light. He thought of the kettle. He thought of a hand laid against the side of his face in the white morning can, a voice that did not laugh at his ghost, and a promise made across the table while the rain came softly down the glass. He thought of all the sleeping people up there in the dimmed down city, oblivious and ordinary and entirely his, not one of them his, too, abandoned to a warm and endless, almost no matter how kindly it was offered. So he chose. He let the gray self understand that he was going home, and that he was taking all of them with him. Not down into the warm to wait forever, but all the way through and all the way out, into wherever finished things go. He turned to the echo in the armchair, to the borrowed face he loved, and he let his voice break, and did not try to stop it breaking, and he told it that he would start with her, that he would finish it with her, the way he had never been given a chance to, and then he would do the rest, all of them, as many as it took. And the borrowed face, his aunt's face, the softest thing in him, looked at him with a pride so large that the gold room seemed to brighten with it. And the failing hum steadied for just a moment, just long enough. And it asked him only to say the thing he had never gotten to say, and to mean it all the way down, and to let her go. So Peter knelt in the center of the room of gathered voices in the flickering gold light, with the city sleeping far above him, and the resonance straining all around him, and his own lost self watching from the haze. And he began, quietly, in his own cracked and human voice, to say goodbye. He said it to her first. He let out all the things he had carried for years and never said, because there had been no one left to say them to. The gratitude and the guilt and the love and the long ache of growing up into a man she would never get to meet. He said it slowly, and he meant every word of it all the way down, and as he said it, the borrowed face softened and smiled, and the gold light passed through her more and more. And the warm thing that had worn his aunt's voice to give him, somewhere soft to land, finished at last the leaving it had been caught in for 50 years, went gently all the way through the door and out the other side. And the last of it was not a cry or a wrench, but only a long, peaceful, grateful exhale, the sound of a held breath finally let out, the sound of a thing that has been almost gone for a very long time, finally, softly, becoming gone. And then there were 10,000 more. He stayed there in the center of the room through what was left of that long night under the world, tea, and he said goodbye and goodbye and goodbye. He gave each unfinished thing the ending it had been caught without. The half-sung lullaby he sang quietly to its close. The apology carried to a doorstep he finally spoke aloud into the gold. The thank you that had come too late he let arrive at last, one by one, and then in their hundreds, and then in a great gentle tide. The gathered almosts of the city completed themselves through him and passed out of the warm and into whatever waited on the other side. One by one, the drifting fragments of light winked softly out, not snuffed, but fulfilled, and the great gold room began, slowly, to dim, and the warm air began, very slowly, to cool. Even his own lost echo. Near the end, when most of the light had gone, the weary gray Peter in the sun-faded suit came and stood over the kneeling one, and there was no more temptation in him now, only a kind of peace. Peter looked up at himself and said the goodbye that was hardest of all. The goodbye to the version of him that had stayed, that had stopped, that had finally been allowed to rest. He told it that it was all right, that it could go, that he would carry it now, that he had it from here. And the gray echo smiled his own smile one last time, free of its exhaustion at last, and let go, and went through the door, and was gone. And Peter knelt alone in the last of the dimming light, emptied out and aching, and entirely, unbearably alive. The hum in the stone had gone quiet. The straining had stopped. The resonance was closing, gently, from the inside, the way a wound closes when you finally stop reopening it. The room of gathered voices was nearly dark now, the last few fragments thinning out like breath on cold glass. And Peter got to his feet, and his whole body shook, and he had nothing left, and he knew it. And he turned in the failing gold toward the far side of the great dimming room, where the door he had come in by still stood ajar, and beyond it the long stairs and the impossible platform, and the iron ladder, and somewhere at the top of all of it, a coin of gray, rainy light, and a window, and a kettle, and a woman who was waiting. He had remembered the way back. Now he only had to climb it. The climb back up was the longest of his life, and the gentlest. He went slowly. There was no reason left to hurry, for the danger had passed. The resonance had closed. The city above him was safe and sleeping, and would never know how close it had come to dreaming a dream it could not wake from. So Peter took the long stairs one at a time, the way you take stairs when your whole body is a single ache and your heart is a wrung-out cloth. And as he climbed, the impossible place came quietly apart behind him. It did not collapse. That would have been too violent a thing for what it had been. It simply finished the way the almost had finished. The room of gathered voices, empty now, let itself go dark behind him with something that felt almost like relief. It was a strange thing to climb up through a place that was unmaking itself so peacefully. Nothing fell, nothing broke. The amber light only thinned, the way the light thins in a room at the end of a long afternoon. Gradual and gentle, and asking nothing of anyone, till the gold became honey, and the honey became dusk, and the dusk became the soft, ordinary stark of any forgotten tunnel anywhere beneath any city. The murmuring that had filled the great room and threaded up through 50 years of stone to find him on a rooftop was gone entirely now. And in its place was only the small sounds of his own climbing, the scuff of his boots, the creak of old iron, his own slow breathing. And he found that he was glad of the quiet, that the quiet was the proof the work had been done. As he passed back up through the long descending stair, the beautiful, impossible mosaics let go their hold on the walls. The city that almost was, the bridges built in the wrong places, the names of stations no train had ever served. All of them dimmed and softened and faded gently into the stone. Not erased, but released, let go at last into the dark from which someone's grief had once so lovingly summoned them. By the time he reached the impossible platform with its hexagonal tile and its gas lamps and its gold and green name that had never been real, The amber light was nearly gone. In the great old station that a dead and lonely man had built to keep the city's lost futures warm was settling quietly back into ordinary darkness, finished and fulfilled and free to be forgotten at last. He stood on the platform a moment in the dimming and the cooling air, and he thought he ought to feel triumphant, and he did not. Feel the way you feel after a long weeping, after a long grief, after a thing has finally been set down that you carried so long you had forgotten it was even a weight, hollowed out. Light in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. Light the way a room is light after you have finally opened a window that had been painted shut for years. He found the iron ladder by feel in the dark, and he began to climb, up through the warm shaft that was no longer warm, for the breath of the place had stilled now, and the air had gone ordinary and cool and faintly of rain, up past the deep dark stone that no longer hummed in his teeth, up past the old brick and the older concrete, his hands finding the rungs by memory, his body climbing on something past exhaustion, on the pure animal certainty of up, toward the light, toward home. The coin of gray sky above him, which had shrunk on the way down to a faint smudge in the dark, grew slowly as he climbed, to a fist, to a saucer, to a window onto the world, and it changed color as it grew, because the night had turned while he was under it, and the gray of the rainy dark was giving way at the top of the shaft to the first pale silver of the coming dawn. He came up out of the grate into the crooked old alley like a man surfacing from deep water, and he knelt there a moment on the wet pavement, just breathing, just being a person on the surface of the world in the open air. The rain had stopped. Somewhere in the long night it had finally exhausted itself, and now the whole city was washed and dripping and faintly luminous, every wet surface catching the slow brightening of the eastern sky. He reached down and slid the heavy iron grate back into place over the dark, and it settled with a soft and final sound, and the way down was closed. He stayed crouched over it a moment longer with his hand flat against the cold iron, and he said his last goodbye. Not aloud and not in words, only in the quiet of his own chest, to the room of gathered voices, and to the lonely man who had built it out of his unbearable tenderness, and to the soft, broad voice that had loved him all the way to the point of letting him go. He gave them his thanks. He wished them rest, the real kind, the finished kind, the kind that comes only after the goodbye has been fully said. And then he stood, and his knees screamed, and he laughed a little at his own ruined body, and he stepped to the edge of the alley and looked up at the lightning sky. He reached up out of pure habit, out of the deep grooves a life wears into a person, and turned up the gain on the little scanner, and listened, and there was only static, soft, ordinary, beautiful static, the plain electric snow of a city, policing its own quiet hours, dispatchers murmuring street names, the gentle nocturnal arithmetic of 8 million sleeping lives. No voice, no thread of warmth woven down inside it. No one calling his name up out of the deep, only the static, doing what static does, meaning nothing at all. And he found, to his quiet surprise, that the nothing did not ache the way he had been afraid it would. The voice was gone, and he had been the one to let it go, and that was not the same as losing it. That was something he had not understood until this very night, kneeling in the gold light, finishing the goodbyes he had been caught without for years. There is a difference between a thing being torn from you and a thing being gently, lovingly, finally released. The first leaves a wound that will not close. The second leaves a scar that is already healed, that you can press without flinching, that is simply part of the shape of you now. He would carry his grief the rest of his life, the way he carried everything, but he understood now that he could carry it finished. He could carry it the way you carry a smooth stone in your pocket from a place you loved and lost, not as a weight, but as a keeping. So he reached up and turned the scanner off, all the way off, for the first time in years. In the small silence where its murmur had always been felt not like loneliness, but like peace. And then Peter Parker went home. He went home the way he loved best, low over the waking rooftops of his city in the silver light of the coming day. The rain had left everything gleaming. And as he swung out over the avenues, the first true gold of the sunrise found the tops of the towers and lit them one by one like candles, while the streets below stayed soft and blue and sleeping. The web caught, the way it always caught, the one thing in his life he could count on completely, and the city rushed up to meet him and fell away beneath him, rushed up and fell away, and the wet wind was clean and cool against the lenses of his mask. Far below, the early bodega gates were sliding up, and the early buses were sighing to their stops, and the first runners were out on the wet paths along the river. And the whole vast machine of the city was beginning, gently, to wake, oblivious and ordinary and entirely perfectly safe. Prying from up here, in the long, unspooling arc of the web, he could see all of it at once, the way only he ever got to see it. He could see the harbor going from slate to pewter to a pale, beaten silver as the light found the water. He could see steam rising from 100 rooftops where the morning shifts had begun, and lights coming on, one and two at a time in the high windows, each one a person waking into an ordinary day they would never know had nearly been taken from them. He could see a sanitation truck working its slow way down a wet avenue, and a dog walker stamping the cold out of their feet on a corner in a single lit diner with a single figure inside it, pouring the first coffee of the day. Each small, waking thing was a kind of answer to the warm gold trap below, a quiet insistence that this, the unfinished and the ongoing and the merely ordinary, was what living actually was, and that it was worth more than any perfect, changeless almost could ever be. He watched it wake as he swung through it, and he thought he had never loved it more. Not the bright, loud, daytime city that needed so much from him, but this one, this in-between city. This city caught in a soft doorway between night and morning, and, unlike everything down in the dark below, allowed to pass all the way through into the day. That was the difference. He thought that was the whole of it. You were not meant to stay in the doorway. You were meant to go through. The almost had finally been allowed to finish, and now so could the night, and so could he, and the morning was coming up over the rooftops to prove it, cold and clean and whole. The sky was the color of an old photograph turning, at last, into a new one when he came down on the fire escape outside his own window, and she was there. She was at the kitchen window, exactly as she had promised, exactly as the borrowed voice had warned and the truth had confirmed. A woman at a window who had lost no one, who loved a man gone down into the dark, who had stood there through the long, rainy night, watching for him to come home. She had a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of tea, long gone cold, on the sill, and an expression on her face that he would remember for the rest of his life, because it held everything at once, the fear of the long waiting and the flood of the relief and the love that had kept her standing there until dawn. When she saw him land, when she saw him come up out of the night in one piece, having gone all the way down and all the way through and all the way back, she pressed her hand flat against the glass, and Peter pressed his hand against hers from the other side, and for a long moment they stayed like that, the cold glass between them and the gold light coming up behind him, neither of them quite trusting their voice and not needing it. Everything that mattered passed between them through the glass and through the eyes, and through the simple, impossible fact of his being there, the question and its answer both, the asking whether he had truly come back and the promise kept that he had, all of it said and heard without a single word. Then she opened the window and he climbed inside, and the warm dark of the apartment closed over him, and he pushed the mask up off his face into the silver gold morning light. She saw whatever was written there, the hollowness and the lightness and the scar that was already healed, and she did not ask him what had happened, not yet. She knew there would be time for the whole of it later. In the slow, unfolding way, the worst and the most beautiful things always finally got told between them. For now she only put her arms around him, around all of him, the suit still damp, and the body still shaking, and she held on, and he let himself be held. And over her shoulder, through the kitchen window, Peter watched the sun come fully up over the rooftops of New York. The towers caught fire with it, gold and rose and pale clean white. The wet streets ran with light. The city he had carried all night, and for all the years before this night, and would carry for all the years still to come, woke up around him without ever knowing how close it had come to dreaming forever. It woke up and stretched and began another ordinary day. The bodega and the bus and the nurse and the baby and the 8 million private lives, all of them safe, all of them going on. And the two of them stood together in the warm kitchen in the first clean light of the morning, in the quiet that did not need filling, while somewhere the cattle began again to think about boiling. And the long night was over, and there was nothing left to carry that could not, for now, be set gently down. The city was awake, and it was, at last, time to rest. So sleep well. The night is over. In the morning, no matter how long or how dark, the dark before it comes anyway.